If you're frustrated with your lack of progress, if you feel like you're plateauing, or you just don't know how to make any progress in the gym, then this video is for you. If you don't know me, my name's Haley. I'm your realistic and balanced bestie, helping you build a stronger brain and body. This is part 7 of your 7-part guide to literally everything you could ever need to know to have a successful fitness journey. And since this is the last part of the series, today we are talking all things progress and plateaus. I'm going to be debunking some of the biggest misconceptions when it comes to making progress in your fitness journey. I'm going to be explaining how to train to failure, and I'm going to be going over what progressive overload is and how to incorporate it into your programs. We're also going to touch on what to do if you're plateauing and how to know if you're even plateauing or if it's just all in your head. So really quick before we get into it, please make sure you're subscribed if you're watching on YouTube and following me if you're listening to the podcast on Spotify. Also, be sure that you check out the description below to get a bunch of free goodies to aid you on your fitness and mindset journey. Now, let's go ahead and get into it. We are going to start with the 3 biggest misconceptions when it comes to your fitness journey. Number 1 being that sweating is a sign of burning calories. Sweat is simply just your body primarily trying to prevent itself from overheating. Sweat helps your body regulate its body temperature, which is a huge key when your body temperature has been raised after doing a really intense workout. And sweating might help you temporarily lose water weight, but it's not necessarily going to make you burn more calories. And contrary to popular belief, you can burn calories while doing exercises that aren't going to make you sweat that much. So sometimes lifting doesn't necessarily make you sweat a bunch in comparison to doing something like an intense cardio session, but that weightlifting session might actually burn more calories than your cardio session did. Now, this isn't to say that you should never ever try to sweat, but just keep in mind that just because you're sweating doesn't necessarily mean that you're burning a bunch of calories. Now, the second biggest misconception is that muscle weighs more than fat. The truth is that muscle and fat are 2 completely separate things that are coexisting in your body at the same time, and they weigh the same amount. The difference here is that muscle is a lot more dense than fat is. So that means that muscle takes up less space than fat does. So to think about it visually, you might be able to fit 2 pounds of muscle in the same amount of space that you're able to fit just 1 pound of fat. And that is because the muscle is a lot more densely packed, so it squeezes in there better than your fat does, because your fat is just simply a lot more spread out and it takes up a little bit more volume than that muscle mass does. So this doesn't mean that they weigh different amounts, it just means that they take up a little bit different space because of their density. And the last misconception that I want to quickly cover is that abs are built in the kitchen. And I'm probably not going to disagree with this in the sense that you think I might be disagreeing with it. My biggest problem with this saying is the fact that I think a lot of people take it as, okay, if I eat right, I will magically have a 6-pack. But the truth is that your abs are a muscle just like anything else. So if you want to have that definition, you do have to train them. I like to switch up this quote when I tell it to my clients, and I just tell them that abs are built in the gym, but they're revealed in the kitchen, because I think that's a lot more truthful to how it really works. And it gives people a little bit less of a confusion around the topic, because a lot of times people will lose weight and they're like, why don't I have a 6-pack? I've been losing all this fat. I have no more fat left on my stomach. But the 6-pack isn't just going to magically show up when you lose weight. It's also important to note that abs are just like any muscle again. So genetics is going to really come into play here with how much muscle definition you're going to get, how hard you have to train them, and what your ab definition is going to look like compared to somebody else. I also feel like it's important to note that training for a 6-pack versus training for a strong core versus training for a slim core are all going to be 3 completely different protocols that you have to follow in order to achieve that goal. So if you want a 6-pack, you want to really focus on crunching movements or anything where you're bringing your knees and your chest closer together. So leg lifts would also work for this, reverse crunches, anything where you are decreasing that space between your chest and your knees. For a functionally strong core, you want to focus on really heavy stability movements. So this is going to be things like planks or overhead marches. A lot of times these are pretty heavily weight focused, but the goal with a strong core is to really make sure that it's stable and that it's just kind of rock solid, that you are just sturdy and solid no matter what you're doing. And to train for a more slim and slender core, you want to try to have a good mix of both of those different protocols, but you also want to mix in a lot of really deep core work for a more slim core focus. Of course, a mix of all 3 protocols is kind of what I recommend for most people, because it's just really good to have a well-rounded balance here. And also be sure that you're not afraid to use weights when you're training your ab. Because I know a lot of people think if you use weights when you're training your abs, that's gonna make your abs a lot more big and bulky. That is not the case. That is not how this works. You have to progressively overload them just like you overload any other muscle, which means the easiest way to overload them is by increasing the weight. Because at a certain point, when you're doing 50 crunches every single day, you can't just keep overloading it by doing 60, 70, 80, 90, 100 crunches, because at what point are you just doing 1,000 crunches when you could have just been progressively overloaded by adding 5 pounds, 10 pounds here and there while you're doing those crunches? Now, to incorporate progressive overload properly, first we have to know what the fuck it is. So to put it simply, progressive overload is just increasing the amount of stress that you put on your muscles from workout to workout. This is key because without progressive overload, you're not getting stronger, and if you're not getting stronger, you're not going to see any changes in your physique. There are so many ways to incorporate progressive overload, and I think the most common ones that we think of are either increasing our reps or the weights that we lift from workout to workout. And these two things are wonderful and they're great to focus on, and they're probably the easiest forms of progressive overload because it's really simple to look at and be like, okay, I did 8 reps last week, this week let me do 9, or let me do the same amount of reps but let me increase the weight from last week. There are 5 main ways that I like to tell people that you can progressively overload that don't involve sets or the weights that are lifted. The first one is increasing your range of motion, which is really highly underrated because this can really increase the stress on your muscles if you're just increasing the range of motion that you have on the same exercises. Number 2 is decreasing your rest times, which again, really highly underrated. Even just shortening your rest time by 10 to 20 seconds is going to make a huge difference, and it's still going to be progressively overloading your muscles from that last time that you did the same exercise. Number 3 is increasing the number of sets per week. This is something I would recommend to more intermediate or advanced lifters because if you're a beginner, you don't really want to keep adding on too many sets early on because it's just going to cause you to increase your risk of overtraining, and we don't want that. Number 4 is decreasing your tempo. So this could mean doing things like adding pause reps or just lowering the amount of time that it takes you in the eccentric portion of an exercise, or just simply focusing on going really, really slow throughout the entire course of the exercise. This one is so much more challenging than it sounds like, and it really is one of the best ways to progressively overload your muscles, especially when you're hitting a point where you physically can't lift any more weight or do any more reps. This is the one that is going to push you to that next level. And number 5 is going to be decreasing the amount of rest between workout to workout. Now, this one is also something I would recommend for more intermediate to advanced because it does involve a lot of play with your programming and really kind of switching things around. So you might start with doing squats on Mondays and Fridays, and then to progressively overload this without changing the reps, the sets, the weights, anything like that, you would just simply switch it from that to doing squats on Monday and on Thursday. So you're just slowly decreasing the rest time, and you don't really want to do anything back to back necessarily, just decreasing the amount of time that you go from doing that workout to the next time that you do that workout. These forms of progressive overload are really, really helpful if you're getting bored in your training, or if you're just in a point where you're like, I need to switch something up or else I'm going to lose my mind, because we've all been there. And it's really great to just try these out to make sure that you're still progressing week to week, but you're not getting super bored with your program, and you're not feeling like you're just stuck at trying to increase the sets or trying to increase the weight, because sometimes that can get to a point where you're like, I can't keep doing this. I don't know what I'm doing. So trying one of these other forms of progressive overload can really, really help get you out of that rut. Now, when you should progress on an exercise is going to be completely different for every single person. And if your program uses things like rep ranges, which all of the programs on my app do, then one of the best ways to progress is by looking at that rep range and seeing how many reps you did the last time that you did this exercise. So for example, if last week you were assigned shoulder presses for 10 to 12 reps and you lifted 25 pounds for 10 reps, then the next week you might lift the same 25 pounds for 11 reps. Now, once you reach the higher end of the rep range, which in this case is going to be 12 reps, then that's when you might want to start adding some weight and going back to the lower end of the rep range. Again, this is really just the easiest way to keep track of it and make sure that you're progressing in a way that's really easy to look at and kind of take the guesswork out of it, because you can make sure that you are either adding your reps or you're adding some weight and going back to the lower end of that rep range. Now, if you're like, Haley, I don't know what to do, I cannot lift the next amount of weight for that lower rep range amount, then that is when you're gonna use some of those other progressive overload techniques, because it's gonna help you really break that barrier between being stuck at one weight and not being able to lift that amount of weight. So that would be when I might shorten my rest time or decrease my tempo a little bit at that original weight for the original amount of reps, and really trying to push through that plateau so that you can easily move on up to adding some more weight and starting at the lower end of that rep range. Now, all of this talk of pushing ourselves close to failure and really focusing on progressing is going to beg the question, how do I know if I'm getting close to failure? Now, when we talk about going close to failure, a lot of people don't actually know what their failure point actually is, and if they do think they know, they're probably wrong by anywhere from 5 to 10 reps, which is a lot of reps to be leaving on the table. So some of the 5 key indicators that you're really actually getting close to that failure point are if your tempo starts to slow down drastically, meaning you're really pushing through at a super slow tempo, and not on purpose, your body just physically is going super slow because it's actually getting to a point where it can't lift anymore. Number 2, if you're feeling really heavy tension or shakiness in the working muscle, and this isn't to be confused with a burn in the muscle, because a burn really isn't a sign that you're actually getting close to failure. It's just something that happens when you're working on a muscle. Number 3, your range of motion is gonna start to decrease pretty drastically, meaning you might only be able to do half reps before your body is literally incapable of getting further to go all the way through the range of motion. Number 4, your heart rate is going to increase, and you're gonna feel like you're really having to focus on taking some deep breaths because your body is no longer just naturally allowing you to breathe. You're really having to be like, okay, let me take a deep breath while I do this. And number 5, the most common way to actually know you're getting close to failure is by actually training to failure. Now, I do recommend doing this on machines or doing it when you have a spotter or something along those lines, because of course, training to failure on some exercises is gonna be more dangerous than training to failure on others. So starting with something like leg extension or a shoulder press machine, something where you can really easily actually test your failure point and you're not putting yourself at risk of injuring yourself, that is going to be a great way to actually figure out what your failure point is, and going until you physically cannot lift that weight up anymore. Now, another really easy way to gauge your failure point without actually going to failure, because I know that does scare some people because it scared me. So this has become my new favorite way to actually try to gauge whether or not I'm pushing myself close to failure. And all you're gonna do is stop when you think that you're 1 to 2 reps away from failure. So when you're like, okay, I really think I'm in that last portion of my exercise where if I did 1 to 2 more, I would be absolutely done. Stop right there. And then you're gonna take a 10 to 20 second break, even just taking 4 to 5 really deep breaths here. And then you're immediately gonna go back into doing that exercise, and you're gonna try to complete the same amount of reps that you did previously. Now, if you can get more than half the amount of reps completed, even after just taking a 10 to 20 second rest, I hate to be the one to tell you, but you are not going anywhere near your failure point. And this is my favorite way to test it, but it's also the most humbling, because when you do this, you're gonna really realize how far you're actually training from your actual failure point. And unfortunately, even with pushing close to failure, there's going to become a point where you're gonna hit a plateau, or you're gonna think that you're hitting a plateau. And this is inevitable, but it is also totally normal, because every single person who is in their fitness journey has experienced a plateau or is going to experience a plateau. But it's also important to remember that some exercises are simply harder than other exercises. So if you've been stuck at trying to do a compound exercise and you're stuck at the same number of reps, same amount of weight, you really can't slow your tempo down, you can't do anything to progressively overload this exercise, you might think you're at a plateau. But if it's a compound exercise, a lot of times those are just going to be a lot harder to progress on than something like a isolation move or an accessory movement. So even if you're stuck at the same amount of reps, same amount of weight for 2, 3, 4 weeks at a time, this doesn't necessarily mean you're plateauing. It might just mean that that exercise is fucking hard. So before making any drastic changes to your program, you want to make sure that you are actually in a plateau. And to actually know if you're plateauing or not, that means you have to have actual tangible tracking of your progress from your previous weeks of working out. This means progress pictures, measurements, data of your lifts, or even recordings of your lifts. And the recordings is a huge component here, because if you look back at a recording of you doing a specific lift 2, 3, 4 weeks ago, and you compare that to you doing the same lift right now, and you notice that your form is drastically better in the video of you now versus that video of you in the very beginning, then this is important to note, because this is still progress. It doesn't really feel like it when we're not looking back on it, because in the moment you just think that you're not improving your weight, you're not improving the amount of reps, and you don't really realize that your body is getting stronger at this exercise, because improving your form is a really measurable notice of actually progressing on an exercise. And it has nothing to do with the amount of weight lifted. Sometimes it can also be really hard when we start to compare ourselves to other people and we start to think, oh, well, they can lift that amount of weight and I can't, so I must be plateauing because I can't get up to that amount of weight yet. But that's actually not proof of you plateauing at all. It's simply proof that some people's bodies respond differently to the same exercises as other people's bodies. Now, if you've been tracking your progress and you really are sitting here like, no, there has been absolutely no progress in my measurements, my body composition, my lifts, my form, there's absolutely nothing that is improving or changing at all, then that is when you want to start looking at your nutrition. So if you've been in a deficit this entire time, this might be time to start increasing your calories a little bit. And if you've been in a bulk this entire time, this might be time to go back to maintenance just for a little bit and switch up your training for a temporary period. Because again, our bodies are not necessarily meant to either be living in the extreme of super low calories or super high calories 24/7. There are times when you have to take diet breaks, there are times when you have to go back to maintenance, and this is just all part of the journey. And sometimes our bodies are just telling us, I can't handle this anymore, we need to switch something up, we need to go to maintenance, and I need to recover just a little bit. And that brings me to the point that if you think that you're plateauing, you really want to make sure you're looking at your recovery, your rest, and your hydration. I actually just did a whole episode on really maximizing these 3 things and making sure that you're getting the most out of your recovery. So if you think you're plateauing, I would highly recommend taking a look at that and make sure that you're doing all those things before you jump to conclusions and think that you're stuck at this weight forever and nothing is going to change and you are absolutely out of luck. So while progressing in the gym is at its core a pretty simple process, I think so many things have overcomplicated it for us, and I think this goes for a lot of things in the gym. So I really do hope that this was able to help you make sure you're progressing in the gym, getting stronger, and avoiding any plateaus. If this episode helped you break through a plateau in any way, shape, or form, please shoot me a DM on Instagram at Haley Lene so that I can give you some props on this and answer any questions that you might have about your journey. Until next time, be kind to your mind, to your body, and to others, and happy healing.